Hello, I'm Neil Bradley, Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I hope you enjoyed learning about the local impact of business as much as I have today. I'm joining you from our nation's capital. You know, it's here in Washington, D.C., where public policy is set. But its impact, well, that's felt in local communities like those in North Texas and across this great country. On no place is that more true than in government regulation. Someone in Washington writes the rules, and everyone else has to live by them. One of the great opportunities ahead of the incoming Trump administration and this new Congress is to roll back regulatory overreach and micromanagement of business decisions. Getting regulation right has the opportunity to increase economic growth and opportunity for businesses, communities, and families across this country. To get started, let's hear from some of the lawmakers who are going to be on the front lines of this effort.
Hi, my name is Brandon Gill, and I'm the new representative from Texas's 26th Congressional District.
Hey everyone, Congressman August Pfluger here.
Hello, Congressman Pete Sessions from Waco, Texas.
Over the past 4 years, the Biden administration has issued nearly 1,200 different regulations that impose various costs on American families and businesses. Collectively, these new regulations will, by the administration's own estimates, cost $1.8 trillion. And in reality, the cost is likely much higher. This amounts to a massive stealth tax paid by the American people through lower pay and higher prices for the goods and services that we buy every day.
Not only that, but regulations mean lots of paperwork that must be filled out by families and employers. The Biden administration regulations have imposed a paperwork burden that is equivalent to 360 million hours. If one person had to fill out all that paperwork, it would take them an estimated 41,000 years.
Thousands of new regulations that impact not only business, but impact jobs and impact our ability as a capitalist nation to do business and compete around the globe.
That's why in Congress, I'm going to be focused on deregulation. It's time to unleash the power of American business and lower costs for families by advancing policies that encourage innovation and grow the economy.
As a former chairman of the Board of Chamber in Texas, I learned firsthand when I came to Congress how important that relationship is from people back home, through the chamber, to talking to members of Congress. And now, the United States Congress will be working with the U.S. Chamber. We'll work with the U.S. Chamber to make sure that we not only address these needs, but ensure that we have a tax code that ensures that as America moves forward, that capitalism and rule of law are important behaviors that the American people will count on.
It is clear that we have a lot of work to do. You know, a lot of that work is going to build on the efforts of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce over the past several years. The U.S. Chamber's Litigation Center has been fighting the regulatory state, filing over 20 separate federal lawsuits against federal regulatory overreach. And I might add, we've been quite successful scoring victories against things like the FTC's non-compete rule. But as successful as we've been, there's a lot more that needs to be done to rein in regulatory overreach. To help us unpack the extent of overregulation in America today and to understand what we might be able to do about it, I'm pleased to be joined by two experts. Susan Dudley is the former director of the regulatory branch of the Office of Management and Budget. She is the founder of the Regulatory Center at George Washington University and is a renowned expert on the regulatory process in Washington, D.C. Doug Holtz-Aiken is the former director of the Congressional Budget Office and is president of American Action Forum. He's an economist by training, and he can help us understand how all of this regulation from Washington actually impacts American communities, what it does to business, economic growth, and all important for American families, prices and wages. So Susan, Doug, thanks for joining us today. Let's jump into the conversation. Susan, you've been tracking for years now the extent of regulation coming out of all of these three-letter agencies in Washington. Tell us a little bit about where we are today, some of the trends that you're seeing, and maybe what's changed over the last several years.
Yeah, we certainly have seen a growth in regulatory activity, really for the last several decades, not just several years. And it has been increasing sometimes faster than others, but regardless of party in power, we've seen that. It's not easy to measure because, as you said, the impact of regulations is not, we can't see it in the fiscal budget, we can't see it in the debt, the national debt, the taxes. Regulations affect us in different ways, but yes, as you've said, it's been growing.
So, yeah, we don't write a check to the Treasury that says, here's my cost for regulation, but the cost is real nonetheless. Give us a little bit of kind of what you've been calculating on the number of regulations, a little bit of the cost, and then, Doug, I'd love to hear about how you think that impacts the economy.
Yeah, so as I say, if you look at numbers of regulations, the staffing of the regulatory agencies, the pages in the code of federal regulations, that has all been steadily increasing. And Doug has done a lot of work on that as well.
Yeah. Doug?
So we try to keep track of the cost of regulation. When agencies issue a major regulation, they also put out an estimate of their estimate of what it costs the private sector to comply with that, the burden imposed on the private sector. We take them at face value, we don't second guess them, we just add them up, and the numbers can be astounding. So over 2 terms, the Obama administration issued a major regulation at an average rate of 1.1 a day for 8 straight years. Cumulative cost $890 billion.
That's a lot of money, $890
That's a lot
billion.
of money. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
So I think of that as a stealth tax increase of about $100 billion a year. And costs are costs. You're a business person, you got to cover the cost, whether it's a tax you have to pay or another way to get to the same thing, a regulation they force you to comply with. And that hurts your opportunities to hire people, hurts your chances to expand, hurts all the things we think enhance the productivity in the economy, and that's a headwind to growth. And I worry about this continued expansion of the regulatory state as a real headwind to American prosperity.
So the 800 and some odd billion, that was the Obama administration,
Yes.
but that was a little while ago.
Yes.
The last 4 years, we've had the Biden administration. Have you all crunched the numbers about what the regulatory costs have been
Yes.
over the last 4 years?
So it's good we're all seated. $1.8 trillion.
1.8 trillion. So
Yes.
more than twice the amount that we saw before.
In 1 term, as opposed to 2 terms for the Obama administration. And for the record, the Trump administration in between, about 40 to 50 billion for the 4 years. Night and day different. And I just think that, we don't have to have the numbers right. That pattern is revealing. If you are going to rely on administrative actions, you're going to rely on these regulations. There are going to be more people in the regulatory agencies. There are going to be more pages in the Federal Register. There are going to be more dollars coming out of the pockets of private businesses.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, it doesn't just land with the businesses, it lands with their consumers and their workers, so it hits all of us.
Suzanne was talking about how the state of American business is local, and we had that great opportunity to visit with these local business owners. One of the things that really struck me was if you're a small business owner, you try not to think about Washington very much, but I have to imagine those costs that you just talked about, the impact on those, is it more severe if you're a small business than maybe if you're a big business with your own in-house legal team? Is that the right way to think of it?
Yeah, I think bigger businesses have the capacity to handle more regulation. They've got a dedicated staff, whereas a smaller firm just doesn't and can't.
Yeah.
And they don't have a presence in Washington either, other than places like the Chamber.
Okay, there's lots of work to be done here. We heard about that from the lawmakers as well, and clearly opportunities. I want to go back to how we think about this going forward. Susan, you mentioned that the first Trump administration and the Congress used the Congressional Review Act. Tell us a little bit about what that is, and is that going to be a tool that we could expect the second Trump administration and this Congress to use?
Yes, I think so. So that would apply to regulations issued probably since early August. So not all of the trillions that Doug is talking about, but those recent regulations, using expedited procedures, both houses of Congress can pass a resolution disapproving the rule. And if they do, and that joint resolution goes to the president's desk and he signs it, agencies cannot, first of all, the rule is void, and the agency cannot issue anything that's substantially the same without prior approval from Congress. And so that the Congressional Review Act applies at any time, not just during transitions, but it's particularly relevant during transitions because you do have a new Congress and a new president. So resolutions have gotten to presidents' desks and they vetoed them because it's their own agency's regulations. But here, this new Congress will have a 60-day window to review those regulations issued at the end of the last administration.
Okay, so basically the beginning of August, things that have happened kind of since then, the chance to review it. But as Doug pointed out, there's been a lot of regulations that were done, the 3.5 years prior. What do you expect happens maybe with some of those? And are there opportunities to revisit those, or is it just once it's done, it's done?
It's more cumbersome. So we have a dashboard where we're tracking which regulations will be in that CRA window, and it looks like there are about 1,300. More than 100 of which are significant, and several dozen will have impacts of $100 million or more, dollars or more. But other than those, and even though that's a lot, it's still a small number in the whole scheme of things. To revise or rescind a regulation, agencies have to go through all the same steps that they went through to issue it in the first place. So that involves developing a record that supports the new regulation, going through notice and comment, getting public input, issuing a final regulation, and then of course that is subject to litigation and other things. So that it's a lengthy process.
But that's where the processes that you described earlier really come into play. So Doug, if I think we should expect that the second Trump administration might have a similar or even more aggressive anti-regulatory approach, right?
This is now an experienced crowd that has done this before, and it's not going to take 18 months to get going. So I would expect to see
out the gate
a big move on the regulatory front.
Big move on the regulatory. Some things fast using the Congressional Review Act. Some things a little slower because of going through that process. But if they adopt the types of rules that they adopted the last time, probably a pretty big focus on reducing regulatory costs. Is that a fair thing to suspect?
Again, I think history is the best guide here. If you look at the numbers, the first Trump administration issued a lot of regulations, just at the same pace as the previous administration, but it didn't increase the costs because they had to go through the process that Susan described. They have to go through the full process of public, preliminary rule, public comment, final rule. That's all work. It's another regulation, but they're aiming to reduce the cost in the process.
Reducing regulation costs is a way of controlling inflation. Is that right?
Costs are costs. Take those costs out of the system, and you don't have to raise prices to cover them.
Yeah.
And this is a great time to be talking about this because we're honoring President Jimmy Carter, who, during his presidency over 40 years ago, recognized that regulations may be contributing to the inflation at the time. And he was involved in a bipartisan, believe it or not, bipartisan effort to reduce the burdensome regulations that were hindering growth, hindering innovation. And so we have real evidence from that period, the 70s and 80s, so obviously Reagan continuing those efforts. We have real evidence that the increase in competition and the reduction in regulation led to huge improvements in the economic growth and just social welfare because we had innovations that were restrained by regulatory activity.
That is one of the great deregulation stories in any economy across the globe.
And there's real opportunities, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, none of the above. If you care about economic growth, opportunity, if you care about raising standards of living and wages, this is one of those tools that government has to really make a difference in people's lives, isn't it? Well, there's a lot of work to do. We heard it from the lawmakers. We've been inspired by these business owners in Texas. And now, Doug, thanks to you, Susan, thanks to you, we are much better informed about what we can do to combat regulatory overreach, and more importantly, what success will mean for American families and businesses all across this great country. So thank you for your work and for joining us today. And thank you for joining us today for this year's edition of the State of American Business. You know, we chose to focus on regulatory overreach given its importance to businesses across this country and for the opportunities that exist to roll back regulations and to create greater economic growth and opportunity across this land. Regulatory overreach is just one of countless issues that we're working on at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. But all these issues have one thing in common. If we get them right, we'll have a better, more prosperous future. And after all, that's what we're all working towards. Thanks for joining us today.